Hello, class. This week we're going to talk about something that I'm terming microgenres or instructive microgenres. These are rhetorical moves or common conventional ways of integrating certain elements into your technical writing. That's still pretty complicated to talk about. So just think about it as these are what is expected when you try to define something or describe something or instruct someone in how to do something. These are the different ways that are expected, the different things you're supposed to do to help your audience follow along as clearly as concisely as possible. These micro genres are not often on their own. I mean, you do find instructions on their own or definitions in a dictionary, but for the most part, they are integrated into larger technical documents. You have to define what your variables are in a lab report. You have to describe what you found in a lab report. You have to talk about what you did in a methodology section that's instructions. And the same is true of recommendation reports, inspection reports, brochures, fact sheets. All of these things integrate these elements in greater or lesser degree, including your memo, which is due for Practicum 2, which is due relatively soon. So, what you're being asked to do in that is to define and describe the way rhetoric is used in your field. So, when we talk about this, you can think about how to write better instructions and how to write better definitions for your own professional and academic purposes, or you can think explicitly about Practicum 2 and see how to help you out with that. So before we do that, I did want to review real quick epistemic rhetoric and this idea of epistemology and the use of words. We talked about this last week, and it seems like you guys followed along no problem, which kudos to you. I know there have been some issues in the past, but if you do have a question, please let me know. Shoot me an email, come by office hours, whatever you need to talk about this. What you're being asked to do is to discuss a present and present complex subject matter in a clear and concise way. That subject matter is, how do you think words and knowledge and texts are all interrelated in your field? So how do texts transfer or contribute to or build knowledge in your field? So we talked about these different broad stroke approaches or broader viewpoints and perspectives on what rhetoric is doing. And your goal is to think about how does your field look at the use of words? Is it an ontological thing where meaning is created through the discussion, or is it a methodological thing where through argumentation and further writing and poster presentations, that sort of thing, you get to a greater sense of the truth, or is it something in between? So your goal is to start talking about this, but you can also think about epistemic rhetoric as central to technical communication. In other words, the understanding of what words are doing to help communicate knowledge is a central gate through which you have to navigate in order to effectively communicate, especially when you're talking to people outside of your discipline, people that are not experts in engineering or animal science or whatever else. So that's why we talked about this idea of rhetorical epistemology, or how words shape language or shape truth or shape knowledge. Absolute truth, knowledge, what we accept to be true, objectively true, and how words are used to take our subjective understanding or perceived understanding and lead towards a better understanding of absolute truth. Okay, so you either have this methodological approach where you go back and forth, either with yourself or with other rhetors, and try to get towards a better understanding of the truth, narrowing in through greater conversation or debate. You have ontological truth, where you have socially derived understanding, where you can't really understand absolute knowledge. There's no such thing as purely objective truth. There's only what we can talk about and how we can talk about it, which by necessity means that the words that we choose create truth. Okay? And then you have sociological, which says there is absolute truth when it comes to the material world, but there is no absolute truth when it comes to the social world. And where you draw that line makes a big difference. We definitely talked about this in terms of why it's important to stylistic approach. Later on this week, I'm going to release a second lecture that talks about stylistic approach, especially when it comes to Pinker and this idea of tree and webs and that sort of stuff. The chapter I'm having you read this week. Pay attention to it and think about what he's talking about in terms of branching sentences and that sort of stuff when you are thinking about the use of or what clear rhetoric looks like and what the purpose of rhetoric is. Is it to transfer knowledge? Is it to build knowledge through conversation? Is it something else in between? And when he's talking about sentence style, it might seem like a stretch, but there is a lot of overlap between what the rhetorical approach is in the way he's talking about it, but also in how you individually approach sentences is going to make a big difference in terms of whether you are approaching them methodologically, ontologically, or whatever else. Okay. But obviously we haven't just talked about, epistemology in this class. We've also talked about genre, and that's central to your memo. Last week I covered some of the basics in the memo format. If you have any questions about it, please let me know. There are all these different elements or aspects or different types of memos, right? If you have any questions about any of the types, again, please let me know. I will say we will talk about instructions today, okay? Some procedural memos are more detailed and well-written instructions, and some are just like directives in terms of you need to do this. And when it comes to your memo for Practicum 2, you, again, are putting together a little bit of gray literature, which is to say unpublished arguments, okay, and a little bit of an article brief based off of, okay, this is what Brumet's saying, and this is how it matters to you, to your auditor. Okay. Also, make sure that you keep in mind these different elements that help organize a memo, because they are important in helping you position information so that it's as clearly and effectively used as possible. Okay. So you have stylistic approach, you have genre, and we have grammar. And like I said, we will talk about grammatical norms a little bit more in another lecture this week. We also talked a little bit about primary appeals. One of the reasons this is important is because in your memo, you are being asked to use credible support. So I do want to touch on this as the first thing we really deal with is how do we appeal to our audience through logos, ethos, and pathos, but more importantly, for the sake of technical writing, because I'm assuming that you guys can find sources relatively easily, and I'm assuming that by talking about the exigence, you guys can develop pathos, okay? But we want to talk about how do we build ethos or credibility. That's a central element in technical writing, especially since you are writing as a subject matter expert to try to convince or talk to or inform a non-expert. All right. So we're going to start this conversation. We'll definitely talk about it more and more as the semester goes along. But ethos is central to technical writing in that we are talking about audience and purpose. Well, if you have a credible purpose, okay, then your character as the rhetor is better understood, and your auditor can appreciate where you're coming from. Okay, so when we talk about credible support, I already kind of talked about this. We want to focus on this idea of ethos and the character of the rhetor. Okay. Now, the best way to think about this is that ethos is how well does your auditor understand you? Okay. Now, there are a number of different ways that we can interpret this. And the reason this is important is because, as I mentioned before, your argument doesn't stand on its own in technical writing. This is not an argumentative thing. You're often not trying to prove much of anything, but trying to inform someone and inform your auditor of the content. So this is important in technical writing, and this is important in technical writing, because you can try to inform your auditor all you want, but if they don't trust you, or if they have no way to understand you, then this is not going to matter at all. All right. So where do we build credibility in the writing process? Okay. If this is the writing process, the best places to build credibility are by understanding who your audience is. And we'll talk about this later in the semester. by analyzing your purpose and having a clear understanding of what you're trying to do, right? And clarifying that for the auditor so that they're not like sideswiped by a persuasive argument at the end of your lab report. You lay it out up front. This is what we're going to talk about. This is where my basis is. Through revising. Revising is a very ethos-oriented part of the writing process. Why? Because the whole point of revising is making sure that what you want to say is clear and effectively written, clear, concise, precise, and all that sort of stuff, and effective for your auditor's purpose. So the whole point of revising is thinking from your auditor's point of view. And then, of course, support. The whole purpose of support is to build credibility and ethos through showing where your thoughts align with objective data or with scholarship and trustworthy sources that agree with you. Okay? So what I want to talk about a little bit when we talk about support and research, okay, is how do we bring that in? Now, I'm only going to touch on this because I'm hoping you guys remember this from your first year composition course. But if you don't, please let me know. All right? This is central to Practicum 2, which is why I'm bringing it up now. Okay? But it will be important, obviously, to your final technical report and other things like that. So there are basically 4 different ways to bring in support. Okay? There's direct quotation, which you guys are all familiar with. Every college freshman has had at least one block quote in their papers. It's just when you put in directly what somebody else says. Paraphrase, where you take their ideas and put it in your own words. Summary, where you're taking a large group of information and trying to pare it down. And then indirect quotation. Most people don't think about indirect quotation when they talk about source citation because it's not credible. Indirect quotation is gossip. Like, if I hear that you said something about me, I might quote someone as, oh, John told me that you said that blah, blah, blah. That's my way of giving credit to him for this idea, not putting it in my own words necessarily, and using that to further an argument by distancing myself from it. It's a way to do that. We use it all the time in spoken word and in non-academic and non-technical environments. But obviously, it's not appropriate for your papers. So, when we talk about source citations and integrating sources and using sources effectively, the number one thing you guys want to do, especially as subject matter experts, is to paraphrase, where you bring in major claims and examples from source material and put it in your own words. You are the expert, or at least that's why this auditor wants to hear from you. You know more than they do. So if you spend the whole time with direct quotation, then you are ceding authority to whoever you're quoting. You are not taking ownership of that claim. And this, as a result, is a way to undermine your credibility and ethos, right? It's not going to completely undermine it because direct quotation is useful sometimes, especially when you cannot or should not paraphrase, right? If I cannot say it better, that's when I use a direct quotation. If I should not change the wording because that will take, because I want to look at the word choice and that sort of thing, then I should use direct quotation. But honestly, in technical writing, most of the time when you're writing lit reviews, and we'll get to those later on in the semester, when you're writing literature reviews and you're bringing in sources, what they said and how they said it hardly ever matters. It's what the findings were and how that helps you talk about your exigence or your argument. Okay? So direct quotation doesn't need to be used that often in this. And then you want to make sure to use summary sometimes. Just keep it objective or denotative. Right? Denotative meaning like I'm not telling you what the feeling of it was, but exactly what was in there, and trying to be as objective as possible. This is common in lit reviews, is to use these two things. And literature reviews are also in recommendation reports, in information reports, in a memo. A lit review or a review of an article is the most common way that you bring in sources. Okay. I'm going to talk about this quickly because, again, I don't want to go on about it too much. Let me know if you have any questions about this. The best way to introduce and bring sources into your writing, in the memo, in a speech, in whatever, is to first introduce, okay, by framing the source for the authors. Should they trust it? Is this a source that experts trust? Is this a source that is on the cutting edge? Is this a source that sometimes gets it wrong? Like framing the source for your auditor so they understand why they should read this and why they shouldn't. Okay? So for instance, you're writing your memo for a disciplinary mentor. They have absolutely no idea who Brumet is. And if you don't, then you should look up Brumet and where he's coming from. He's a rhetorician, by the way, so that they know if you paraphrase Brumet's definition of methodological rhetoric, they know why it should be trusted, okay, or how to understand it, right? So that's central to this. Then you integrate either through paraphrase, direct quotation, or summary, okay? Then you cite, okay? You guys can use whatever citation method is most comfortable for you, although I would encourage you not to use MLA because nobody in the sciences uses MLA. Hardly anybody in the humanities uses MLA. It's just easy to teach. So if you don't have a preference, go for APA, right? And then the best way to do this is to situate the information in the larger argument. The key with source citation and source integration and having credible sources is first and foremost, make sure that the argument in the source supplements your claims and what you're trying to say and doesn't supplant. And the best way to ensure that you aren't just inserting this paraphrase for credit, like for the minimum number of sources, or you aren't using it isn't taking over your argument, is to state the significance. Why is it important that your auditor thinks about this or knows this? For the sake of the content, or for the sake of, context, or whatever else, right? Okay. So, I do want to talk about rhetorically aware definitions and instructions and definitions. This is all from Markel, chapter 17, I think it was. Okay, so we're going to go into this in a little more detail. If you need to take a break, go ahead, okay? I will give you a section break after each of the major microgenres before moving on. All right, so when we're talking about rhetorically aware definitions, a lot of people think of a definition as just something they read in the dictionary. Well, the dictionary is a stripped down version of what we all do all the time, and it's a more formal and universal approach that is used as a resource, but we are defining things all the time, okay? If from defining what a good game is, like whether or not you think a football game from this weekend was exciting, then you are defining it in certain ways, or whether or not you think, a movie is good or bad, or that sort of thing. These are all definitions that we offer, and in technical writing, you're offering definitions all the time. Definitions of what is, acceptable stress, or definitions of, what you consider to be a noteworthy result, or whatever else. Okay, so when we talk about rhetorically aware definitions, it's important to know what the characteristics of that genre are, so that when you give a definition, you are giving an effective sense of what the auditor needs to know. Okay, so if I am going to use an example, one that is central to this class and one that I hope you have an understanding of at this point in the semester, is the rhetorical situation. Now, if I'm going to define what the rhetorical situation is, then this is a definition I would give you, right? Is a model of communication that places emphasis on the extrinsic elements of discourse the rhetor must consider when preparing a rhetorical argument, emphasizing adaptability and universality over textual organization and intrinsic content. Now, you might be saying, what the hell is all this about? And I would understand why you think that, because this is a definition for a rhetorician. This is a definition for someone in my field. This makes complete sense to me, but you probably never think about the extrinsic elements of discourse, and you probably have never ever considered what the importance of adaptability and universality over textual organization, which is a genre thing, or intrinsic content. You might not have ever thought about that, but this is like a model of communication. All right, so now if you start parsing it out, you can figure out what this means, right? And if I'm writing this for members of the class, I might break it down and use simpler words to fit that rhetorical situation, but I'm still going to do certain moves regardless of what kind of definition I'm giving, because that's what we expect when we see that there's a definition. So one thing that you might think about is, how would you define an auditor, right? So we've talked about auditors. How would you define what an auditor is? And think about that as we go through with this. So there are basically three different types of definitions. You have parenthetical, you have sentence length, and you have extended definitions. Okay? A parenthetical definition is relatively simple. It's when you put another way to understand something in parentheses so that your auditor can follow along, right? So if I say elements of discourse, the writer or speaker, that's a way to give shorthand real quick what I am trying to get at. Sorry about that. My dog just entered the room. So I'm trying to give you guys a clear sense of what I'm meaning for a word that you might not understand, right? It's a way to do it quick and not spend a lot of time on it, right? Then you have sentence length definitions, okay? An auditor is a rhetorical term that incorporates all categories of addressed or implied audiences of rhetorical appeal, whether textual, performative, or visual, right? So that's a sentence length definition, right? You might not think, okay, I don't write sentences like this. Well, if you say, a good movie is one that then you've already got these elements, right? A rhetorical term, that, right? And if you add something else, then you are on your way towards a better understanding of that. So if we're talking about definitions, then one thing to think about is which type of definition is necessary. And a lot of that depends on how central the term is to your text, to what you're trying to say, whether that's a section or the whole the text as a whole, and a number of other elements. Okay? So if it's not that essential, then I might use a parenthetical definition. If it is essential, I might define it in more length. And if it's absolutely crucial that someone understands something, then I might put an extended definition in there. So when you're talking about this, you might think about where it would go. So in the text means like as I'm reading the memo or as I'm reading the report, I come across this definition. As a marginal gloss, we'll start talking about the design elements later, but a marginal gloss is just like in your textbook when you see a definition in the margins. A hyperlink where you link off to something else, a footnote, okay, a glossary, or an appendix, right? An appendix meaning I need multiple pages to spend to help you understand what I'm talking about, versus a glossary, which is just a single longer definition, right? You might think, okay, when would I ever define something that needs an appendix? Well, if you're trying to talk about, the ramifications of overstressing a beam, then you might want to include a number of different images or drawings to help someone understand all these different things. And that can be seen as a kind of definition, right? Because you're talking about defining what exactly does it look like when this happens. That is also a description, but we can get into that later. Appendix definitions tend to be for the crucial terms that you might cover. All right. So, for instance, in my field, I study Shakespeare and the rhetoric of the early modern period, and that term early modern is often talked about in great detail in a glossary or an appendix of a lot of books, because we have to talk about what years does that entail, where did that term come from, how does it compare to what the people at the time thought, and you can go on and on about it. In fact, there are multiple books written about just that term. And so, the more important that term is, the more you might spend on defining it against other options and that sort of thing. Anyways, what I'm saying is the way you decide on where something goes in your text is to think about, okay, how complex is the idea? A rhetor is not a complex idea at all because I can just say speaker or writer, right? There are other kinds of rhetors, but for the sake of that part of my definition or that part of that text, I just want to get across a relatively simple understanding of rhetor. I don't need to get into the complex nuances of it, right? Or you might think about, what rhetoric is or what knowledge is. Do you really want to spend a lot of time on it, complex on the nuances of it? Then that's a complex idea that you might need to put later on in the text, right? How essential is it? The more essential it is for someone to understand that in order to understand the memo or the report or whatever else, the more likely it needs to be in the text. Okay? Familiarity. If someone is very familiar with the concept, even if they're not familiar with the word or the way you're using or that sort of thing, then you can put it earlier on in the text. Because if it's a simple idea, then I don't have to spend a lot of time to define it, right? And I might also go with unique usage. The more unique something is, the more time you need to definitely show what something is. So another thing from my own research, I talk a lot about public spheres and publics. If I just talk about a public, then everybody in our class would be very confused because that is not a usage that is very familiar to a lot of people, unless you're a rhetorical theorist. And then you might say, oh, publics. Yes, of course. You might know what the public sphere is, so there's some familiarity with that. But when I start talking about what a public is, let alone a rhetorical counterpublic, then I get into unique usage, or a Warnerian rhetorical counterpublic. And then I get into more unique usage, so I might have to spend more time defining what that is, whether that's in a footnote or a glossary or an appendix. Okay, so you got to get into this and think about it. The other side of this is if it's essential and unique and complex, then maybe I have both a sentence level definition in the text and a glossary entry, right? So taking advantage of those different things is important, right? So what is the basic outline of a definition? Well, the conventions are you have at least three elements. You have the term, or what are you trying to define, the category, or how does it fit into the larger context, okay? So how is someone supposed to understand where it fits outside of the text, and then distinguishing characteristics. And these are very much aimed at the auditor. So we have context, we have the auditor, helping the auditor understand, and term, or the content, right? When you're doing this, when you're writing especially a sentence length definition, you want to be specific in stating the category and distinguishing characteristics. No noun clusters that are just kind of vague, okay? Don't describe a specific item if you're defining a class of items, right? So if I'm talking about a rhetorical term or a mode of communication, those are different categories that aren't like very, very narrowly defined. Because if you use a very narrow term to define a term, that's one way to easily end up with a circular definition. The other is just to keep it so vague that there's no real understanding outside of this definition of what it means. And that's what a circular definition is. A circular definition is a definition of a term that has no meaning outside of that, or you have to have an understanding of the term outside of that definition in order to understand it. Okay? So, you might think, okay, well, what does this look like? Here's my sentence length definition, right? Well, we have my term, an auditor. We have the category, a rhetorical term, right? So that category is a noun phrase, okay? It's not a verb. It's not is when. That's a clause. It's a rhetorical term, okay? And then I have distinguishing characteristics, incorporates all categories of addressed or implied audiences of rhetorical appeal, right? That in its own right is a definition. And sometimes you might add qualifiers to help your auditor better understand it. And these qualifiers are usually a way to help them understand how you specifically are using it, so it's more rhetor-oriented. So whether textual, performative, or visual, right? So this is one way to think about it. But even here, we end up with a problem with a circular definition. If you don't know what a rhetorical appeal is, then this can get very confusing. So that's why you have to make sure that these distinguishing characteristics are aimed at who your audience is and are helping them understand what's going on. Right? There are also extended definitions, right? These are more detailed explanations, one or more paragraphs. Okay? They begin with a sentence length definition, although that's not required. And then they also have additional elements, okay, that help your auditor get a better understanding of what's going on. So you might have graphics or examples. Well, these are very auditor oriented. They are trying to help the auditor perceive it in a different way so that they can have a better understanding of the term and be able to use it. Or you have comparison and contrast, analogy, negation. These are ways to help the auditor understand better your interpretation of the term. Okay? Analogy is helping the auditor, but it's also very much about how you are interpreting it. Okay? Negation being, it's not this, right? Well, that assumes an expertise, right? So if you're able to get that comparison and contrast or that negation, then you are trying to help them understand something from your expert point of view. You have partitioning, which is where you break it down into subsequent parts, or principles of operation, or how it works. Those are elements of an extended definition that would hardly ever come into a sentence length, but they can be very useful for understanding what's going on. So if you think about rhetorical epistemology, we went through and talked about both principles of operation, or how words can form knowledge, and partitioned out the different elements of it, right? And then the last one is etymology. And etymology is pure context. If you don't know what etymology is, it's the history and derivation of a word. So where a word comes from, okay? You can see examples of this in Markel. I encourage you to pay attention to this, but you can see here as an extended definition. You have graphic elements to cue you into major contextual clues and to help the auditor follow along. You have examples. You have hyperlinked off to more terminology that they may need to know. You have a partitioning of what exactly the GPS system is. These definitions are not always just simple terms. I'm talking about them in terms of simple things because it's central to, knowing the genre and helping us talk about a shared thing. But often it's much more complex, right? Most extended definitions don't appear in the text. They are often hyperlinked to, maybe footnoted, or glossary or an appendix. If it is a central term around which the whole text rotates, it can be a section on its own. So you might think about your memo. You might have one of your sections, one of your headings, be just about the definition of epistemic rhetoric that you think is central to your discipline. Okay. So when we talk about this, definitions at their core are trying to help the auditor understand this term from your point of view. Okay? They are trying to help the auditors go from their either limited or zero understanding of the term, and through your interpretation, get to a better understanding of the content as a whole. So since definitions are trying to help the auditor understand the content at the center of your text, or that you're trying to establish before moving on to other parts of your text, then what you're trying to do is to constantly keep in mind their needs, not just your own. So when we talk about complexity, essentialness, familiarity, and usage, then that has everything to do with your auditor's understanding of the complexity, not your understanding of the complexity. Your understanding of essentialness, but essentialness in order to help them understand the content. So think about these things as a continuum to help you figure out what kind of definition you want to use. So when we talk about microgenres, we talk about instructions, we talk about definitions, we talk about descriptions. Each of these have their own progression of what is assumed to be part of the genre, right? But instructions are kind of their own thing because even when they're part of a larger genre like a lab report, the methodology is a post hoc or afterward or instructions after that are describing what you've already done. Um, Even when it's part of something else, they follow their own kind of thing. And the reason that they're a little bit different is that as a genre, the goal is to help the auditor execute something. It's not just help them interpret something, but you have an instructional purpose. You want them to understand something so they can execute it, right? So thinking about not just how can they understand this, and if they look at it again, will they be able to do it, but like how can they do what I'm instructing them to do, right? So much like with the sorry, much like with definitions, you have a series of things that are expected and they happen in a certain order. So you have your introduction, right, where you define the appropriate auditor and a clear purpose. If it's within a larger document, then you don't necessarily need to define the auditor, but you have to clearly let them know why they need to do this certain thing. So whereas before I was talking about generalized definitions, what might be useful for you guys to think about is recipes or um, assembly instructions. These will often define the appropriate auditor by using a certain terminology or offering different instructional levels depending on your expertise. Okay, so for instance, there's a blogger that I'm a fan of called the Rogue Engineer, and he offers instructions for someone that has never picked up a power tool, someone who has familiarity with, table saws and that sort of thing, and then someone that has been doing it for years. And at each level, he's giving more precise directions, but also different things like this. But before you get to that, you have to have the introduction that clearly states this is what you're going to do, regardless of who you are, and then this is how we know you're ready for this level of instruction. Okay? So introductions always specify the following for introductions for instructions: who should carry out the task, why the auditor would perform the task, when the task should be performed, and what material will be needed or provided. So this is not always specified explicitly because a lot of times it's implied or it's indeterminate. So for instance, the methods section of a lab report, who should carry out the task, is implied. Whoever wants to replicate this data. Why would the auditor perform the task? To replicate the data or to find something else out. Okay? When should the task be performed? That's indeterminate. It's not important necessarily, but a lot of methodologies will talk about like up front how many days or the experiment was done over or other larger parameters before getting into the nitty gritty. Okay. I mentioned assembly instructions as an example that we can use to follow. Well, IKEA's instructions are world famous both for their obtuseness, but also for their effectiveness. Like they're both incredibly hard to understand, but once you get the language of it, they are universally translated. So what they did, IKEA made the decision not to use any words in their assembly instructions. And the reason for this is because, well, then they don't have to translate, right? And you can see that difficulty if you ever get a Chinese product that's been with the instructions have been translated into English. Chinese and English, there's a big difference between the grammars, and so the translation is pretty rough. And if you don't take the time to do it, it can be very difficult to smooth out the kinks. But IKEA, they offer this. But even without words, we have a clear sense of who should carry out the task, why they would want to do the task, and what material will be needed or provided, right? And then when the task should be performed. We don't necessarily have a when, but we definitely have a where, right? Make sure it's on a soft surface. Okay, who should do it? 2 people. All right, what's needed? These are the tools you need. Everything else is in the box, right? So if we think about it, in terms of instructions, well, the introduction is telling like, hey, what are the auditor's expectations? You're adjusting that, or you're addressing that in the introduction. What are your auditor's skill level or abilities? It has to do with the exigence, right? Why are you giving these instructions? Okay, well then, what kind of detail you need to go into, that sort of thing, depends on who you're talking to. Are your auditors homogeneous or multifaceted? So do you have to write for multiple people? Like I mentioned, the rogue engineer, he has different sets of instructions for different skill levels to help people understand how to put together the furniture or whatever else he's suggesting. IKEA has a universal approach, and they treat their auditors as homogenous even if they aren't, because if you're an adult, then you can do this. If you're an adult and you know how to use a screwdriver, then you can do this. And so that's all they assume, which is why some of their instructions are a little bit harder to figure out if you have not put anything together, any furniture together, or if you've put furniture together and this is your first time with IKEA, because of the way they treat their audience. What vocabulary jargon should you use? It depends on who you're talking to, but that's a constraint, right? Will your readers be anxious? Okay. Or will they be drunk? Or whatever else. Thinking about that sort of thing. So CPR instructions in a restaurant, they're very clear and very visual because they're counting on the wait staff, or chef, whoever's going to go do CPR on a choking customer, to be a little bit anxious. So they try to boil it down as much as they can. And then where will these instructions be read? Where will they be placed? Okay, so the CPR instructions in an ER are much different and much more technical than the CPR instructions at a restaurant. Okay, so you need to think about these things, right? When you're writing out instructions in a text, then you might not have to think about where will these instructions be read necessarily, but like what's expected of this section. How familiar is my audience with the technical jargon that I'm going to deal with in terms of the enzymes I'm using in my chemical equation, or the rig that I've developed for this test, or whatever else, right? And then, so you can see here's a further understanding of, or further, another part of the instructions. And the reason I bring this up is because in the introductions, you also, typically people think about this as part of the introductions, you put in the safety instructions. But a lot of times this is more commonly understood as the section where you contextualize, okay? So you've introduced, well, what's the scope and why should you do it, or who you're talking to, okay? Or what's the purpose and why you're talking to them. And then the scope of the process, or how long is it going to take, right? How long, okay? Detail, I already mentioned. Safety information, all right? All this is included in the context. So first you define what the purpose is, who you're talking to, and then you define and contextualize it by giving sense of, okay, what should you know before you even get started? If this is a process that's going to take multiple days or multiple hours, then you try to let the people know up front that this is a more involved thing. And then safety labels. So you can see here, we don't have any safety labels except for the big X's and frowny faces, which are pretty universal, and then this little symbol, which we all know what that's for, right? But you can also see danger, warning, caution, note. These are common signal words to help people understand the scope of the process and the safety information, right? So you try to identify the scope, any safety concerns, then you itemize, or what are the steps and how should they be accomplished. So you provide detailed and well-organized steps to completing the process, okay? Now, effective instructions are written with a clear sense of how the steps are organized so that there's a clear progression. And the way you show that is through tasks and subtasks. You can number it if you want, or you can just have a clearly understood progression, left to right, that sort of stuff, knowing who you're talking to, right? Um, and then you have clearly labeled subtasks. Okay, so you have step-by-step instructions. These are very common in assembly instructions and recipes and that sort of stuff. You have narrative instructions. This is what's more common in a methodology, okay, where you go through step by step what you did, but it's not labeled in a way that has clear delineations between each step. Okay, and then you have tutorial, which is what you would more see on YouTube, where it's a run through that's not clearly delineated in a number of itemized steps. Okay, and then you should also have built-in feedback statements. All right, it's especially true of step-by-step tutorial instructions. You need feedback statements, and these are things to let you know if you're on the right path, if you're doing the right thing. Okay, so you see this in baking and cooking instructions with like brown the sugar not so much that it starts bubbling or whatever else, right? Or with IKEA, you can see it here. So IKEA makes a clear distinction between subtasks in the circle, which is more inviting, right? And so they use the circle to show that. All right, so this is a subtask, this is a subtask, and then you have feedback statements, right? To know that you're on the right track. This is a feedback statement. If you see the particle board, then you have it facing the right way. If you see the lamination, then you have it facing the wrong way. Okay. You also have the itemized list, numbered, and as I mentioned, subtasks. Right. You want to make sure that you are always crafting instructions with a rhetorical situation in mind, where, when, and who is going to find these instructions and use them. Okay. And then especially in instructions, you want to emphasize clarity and precision over concision. Okay. That might seem counterintuitive, as instructions tend to be short and clipped, but the way you get concision in there is you use the imperative mood. Okay. Unless you're writing a narrative, like in other words, a story of what you did from beginning to end, then you should use the imperative, which is the command. So emphasize, make sure. Okay. These are imperatives. Okay. Include, use, craft, number. Okay. That's the way you get concision, but you want to still clarity and precision over concision. Okay. You can see here other examples. Feedback statements, numbers, okay, subtasks, all that sort of thing. This kind of style is so universal that, it's been mocked, right? But even here, introduction, what am I doing? What's the purpose? Okay, there's the purpose, trust. What do I need? Dialogue, booze, two people, a hex bolt, whatever, a dowel rod for some reason. Okay, so I need all these things, and then how do I do it? Okay, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Right, so I have a clear sense of subtasks. Right, so I jump in the way of the bullet, and the bullet enters. Right, it seems weird, but like we understand this logic no matter what. Same thing with this. Here's a feedback statement. Okay, do call IKEA if you have a question. Don't just do it on your own. Okay, to build the Hadron Collider, step 1 times 30. Do it this time. Add your reactive materials. Nobel Prize. Right. So you guys can see how this works, even if you aren't like up to date on IKEA. You can still make sense of this. But if you write your own instructions, you want to make sure to do each of these steps. Use the imperative. Include graphics. Make craft instructions simply. Okay. And then always make sure you recontextualize the process and provide measurable expected outcomes. What it should look like at the end, or what it should taste like, or whatever else. If it's something for, what are the expected end products? Okay. Often, effective instructions will have a definition of the finished process or a graphical representation, a declaration which should be done next for maintenance or other things, okay, and additional addenda, so troubleshooting guides, FAQs, maintenance, that sort of stuff. Okay, that's what you typically have in instructions. Hopefully this makes sense. This microgenre is a little more isolated than the definitions and descriptions, but it's still a useful thing, and we will need it for your collaborative research report and other documents throughout the course of the semester. So I'm going to talk next about Redder's description, but if you guys want to take a break, I'll take a pause here and give you guys a break. All right, just a little bit longer. Just wanted to cover one last microgenre, the idea of, or the description. Definitions you're going to use a lot to define crucial ideas or what efficiency is or whatever else, especially as a subject matter expert. You're going to have to talk about defining your jargon and the type of information that you find crucial. You're also going to have to describe processes that you've discovered or objects or machines or that sort of thing that you will have to describe in greater detail than you might have to other experts. So when we talk about description, then this is something that's common in a lot of different genres, including memos like Practicum 2 or your final technical report or lab reports and that sort of stuff. There's description of results, there's descriptions of different rhetorical approaches, there's descriptions of everything. It's not just limited to a simple, section of a larger paper. It's something that's common throughout. But there is, much like with definitions, a clear convention to how these things tend to work. When we talk about descriptions, again, much like with definitions, you want to think about it first and foremost as you are describing things so that the auditor can take their first impressions or basic understanding and understand what's going on in that machine or with that object or in that scenario through your interpretation and through your description. That's why, as per a lot of these things, you need concision, precision, and clarity in order to help your audience do that, the technical style that we've been talking about. Now, if we talk about this in terms of the genre constraints, you basically have three types of description. You have objects, mechanisms, and processes. That's very broad categories, but it covers most of the things that you'll ever have to describe. And think about the types of things that you have described in the past. Even storytelling is a description of a process. But regardless of what kind of description that you take on, you are always trying to accomplish one of four major objectives, not one of four major objectives. You're trying to indicate clearly the nature and scope of the description. You're trying to introduce it clearly, okay? A good introduction or a good description has a clear introduction so that an auditor knows what you're trying to describe before you really get into the details of it. It has appropriate level of detail and ends with a brief description, brief conclusion. Okay, so this goes without saying. This is stuff that you've already obviously know intrinsically, even if you aren't explicitly aware of it. But it's useful to think about these things as rhetorical check boxes that you have to do for every description to know that you've got a clear understanding of the scope of this description. So it's not just going to go on for forever, and that you have a clear understanding of what kind of detail you're going to get into that has to do with scope, but also like you have that appropriate detail in there and that you have wrapped it up at the end. Okay. Now, when we're talking about this is where the rhetorical situation comes into effect. When we say appropriate level of detail, well, what does that mean? It means according to the auditor, your audience's understanding, okay? And It also has to do with the context or the location of the text. So if I'm describing something on a poster, then obviously I'm not going to have a lot of detail unless it's visual, and then that'll be something else. Um, if it's in a 200-page report, I can go into a lot more detail, although I may want to offer a shorter description somewhere else in the text. If I have an appendix entry and I'm describing something as part of a definition, then those two microgenres combine, and I can go into detail without worrying about distracting from the main course of the report. In other words, you need to think about the rhetorical situation of these things. Now, here we have what a good description and what it entails. These are the different parts of a good description: introduce, contextualize, describe, conclude. Now, this might look familiar to this idea of source integration because, in essence, they're doing the same thing. If you're bringing in a source, you're bringing it in to help supplement and inform your auditor and convince them of something. Okay? Same thing with a description. If you're bringing in a description, it's usually to offer support for what you're trying to talk about. So if you're trying to describe an efficient engine, or how you can replace a part in order to make an engine more efficient, then you will describe that part as a way to help you talk about how to be more efficient. So you need to introduce it, you need to contextualize it, you need to describe it, and then you need to conclude it. All right? So what does this entail? The introduction, situation, description, larger deliverable or argument. Okay, so why is it there? Why is there this description at all? When you contextualize it, the contextualization justifies the nature and scope and purpose of the description. Then you provide a detailed and well-organized description, and then you recontextualize it. It all goes together. Now, the only real part I'm going to go into any detail about, because the rest of it you can kind of figure out on your own, is this idea of what a clear introduction involves. First, it will define the item or the process. We get back to the idea of the definition. If you're going to define an object, a process, or a mechanism, then you have to have a clear definition of what that is, what class it's in, and what are the characteristics that the auditor can use to help them understand what you're about to describe. Okay? It delineates how it works, if not in great detail, but an overall understanding of what's going on. And then it partitions the principal parts or steps into a roadmap, if you will, if you want to borrow from first-year composition, for what the rest of your description will entail. Okay? Now, grammatically, in both the introduction and the rest of the description, you want to use the present tense. Okay? Now, a lot of people, you might ask, why am I talking about this? Well, even if something happens in the past, if you use the present tense, it forces the auditor to immerse themselves in that space and in that what you're talking about at the moment. The present tense is in the English language is an evergreen tense. It means that it's always present. It's not something that's occurring because that requires a different tense. It's something that is routine, that sort of thing. And so if you describe something in the present tense, then you're forcing someone to picture it as it goes. This is very important for mechanisms and processes, but even objects need it that way. And if you think about how a book works, a story works, those are doing the same thing. Okay? You need to indicate appropriate subcategories and need to clarify with appropriate graphics. Good descriptions involve lots of graphics, either drawings or maps or photographs, whatever you think is going to help, especially if your description is longer than one paragraph. You need to add that kind of detail. And then this is important to both descriptions and instructions. You need to have a good organizational principle. Now, an instruction, typically that's chronological. First you do this, then you do this, then you do this. But in descriptions, you can have spatial, so left to right, top to bottom, in to out, functional, okay? So that's first, second, third, or it can also be, go through one rotation all the way through and then look at it from a different direction all the way through. And so what you're trying to do is just get these give a clear sense of what's going on and why it matters to the auditor. So here, I'm going to just point this out for you guys to look at on your own. Markel 550, this is a useful breakdown of what questions you need to answer in a description, okay, in order to really help your auditor understand the technical specifications behind what you're talking about, regardless of what kind of description you're doing. All right. The other thing I wanted to talk about is this idea of organizational patterns. We're going to come back to this, especially when we talk about the document design and headings and that sort of stuff in a couple weeks. But I wanted to go ahead and point this out. There are basically 4 major kinds of organization. Okay. Spatial, hierarchical, comparison and contrast, and procedural. Now, most descriptions fall into this procedural or spatial organization. But you can think about it in hierarchical terms as well, because if you have smaller sections of the engine that you want to describe in detail, then that's a hierarchical. This is more important than this relationship. Okay. But what's key about this is that regardless of what kind of organization you follow with your description, or even if it's a smaller type of organization, you always want to make this clear to your auditor with signal words and a clear organizational pattern that you show to your audience so they know how to assemble the details in their head as they construct what you describe. That's why images are very useful, but in general you want to give them this organizational pattern so they can effectively and efficiently put together in their head what you're describing. Okay? That's why you go through this process. You situate it, so let them know what's coming. Then you give them the scope, so they know basically how much time they need to devote to understanding the description, but also like how big of an item, how long of a procedure, that sort of thing. And then you have a well-organized description so that your audience can follow along and assemble the thing in their head. And then you recontextualize, offering clear takeaways so that they can make use of and enact or take advantage of what you described to help them understand another process or help them understand the overall report or whatever else. Okay. All these microgenres, descriptions, instructions, definitions, all of these are rhetorical moves or different ways of dealing with common things in technical writing. And they should be, I've been talking about them in very broad, ambiguous terms, and that's because they are often adapted and modified to fit whatever purpose they have in a text. So these conventions that I've talked about are all adaptable, but they are also ways to help your audience understand what you're talking about. So when we say that genre is a constraint that helps you more efficiently communicate your intention, your purpose, so that your auditor interprets it the way that they should or the way that you would hope that they do. Genre constraints help enable this more efficiently, because if I tell someone I'm describing something, a process, by this scope, then they have already started following in their head a predetermined path of what is expected. Same thing with the definition. If I say blank is a blank that blank, then all of a sudden everybody knows I'm giving a description in the English language. So these are things that are common and well understood among technical writers and among the general public, and so you want to make use of them to help provide a more efficient and effective and concise document. All right. So I've gone on for a little bit, and I apologize. I hope you've taken breaks here and there. You probably can tell that I have, just because life intervenes. But I hope that this has helped. Here's the schedule for the week. I will say there will be another lecture this week to talk about Pinker. The stuff in Pinker is relatively dense if you haven't gotten to it yet, but it's also very helpful, and I think it's relatively straightforward for people that aren't grammarians and aren't specialists in that kind of thing. But it can be very useful to understand what syntax is doing and how it works to effectively improve your prose. All right. So we'll talk about that in another lecture, but I don't want to go on for any much longer than I already have. I'll see you guys in class, and take care and have a good night, or have a good day.